The following is an AZPM original production.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of The Press Room from the radio studios of AZPM. I'm your host, Steve Goldstein. Coming up, we'll discuss two people who made opposite decisions on running for Congress, and protesters made their presence felt at the installation of the new U of A president. Joining me to discuss these and other topics are Schmidt of the Tucson Spotlight, Prerana Sannappanavar of the Arizona Daily Star, Paul Ingram of the Tucson Sentinel, and Christopher Conover of AZPM. Thank you all for being here. Paul, I want to start off with a couple of minutes on the funeral of Raúl Grijalva. I know media formally wasn't allowed in. You had some great coverage over at the Sentinel with some photos and everything else. What stood out about the event? Almost some of the vibe, the atmosphere to start with.
I mean, one thing that was really great is you see sort of a who's who of Tucson waiting in line to go in. You know, everyone kind of set up and waited. There was a period that everyone had to line up, and then as they went through the security line, so you kind of get everybody see it. So I was stationed outside on Stone, so I got to photograph not only people going in, but then also kind of the ceremony that they had to bring Grijalva's remains into the ceremony. And you know, it's kind of really interesting. I mean, it's actually his remains. He was cremated, and so his remains were actually in an ola, which is it's a pottery made by a Tohono O'odham artist specifically for him. So it's just an interesting little detail. And of course, on it had a bolo tie, one of Raúl's bolo ties, with a little bit of turquoise set to it. And then of course that was done by a procession of uniformed military members, and then they took that into it. So you were able to see that little bit of ceremony on the outside, which I thought was kind of really interesting. It was really gracious, and it was really poignant.
Yeah. So, Caitlin, we've talked about Raúl Grijalva's death for a couple of programs of the Press Room, but neither you nor Chris was actually here to talk about him. Is there a story? Is there some experience you had in covering him, either that you could share with our audience? Because I think there are so many great stories people have told about him. What about you?
I mean, he just was always so accessible, even as a student. He didn't treat you any differently. I mean, I first encountered him as a student, and he spoke to me with the same level of professionalism and respect as he did the working reporters in the room, and he never changed that demeanor. You know, as he got older, as he rose the ranks, he always treated everyone with that same level of courtesy and respect. And it's sad to see that missing, especially as politics gets more and more divided. So.
Yeah. Chris, how about you?
I'm going to play off one of the things Caitlin said is his accessibility, and I've warned a number of new reporters here at AZPM. When you called Congressman Grijalva's office to set up a phone interview, you'd talk to Ruben Reyes, or if you called DC, one of his staff there, and they'd always say, oh, yes, we'll have the congressman call you back. And I said, you have to be ready, because your phone will ring, and this voice, when you pick it up, will say, hey, it's Raúl. And it will take you a minute to realize that that's Congressman Grijalva, who has called you back personally on the other end. Mm-hmm. And he was always so accessible. And we had a chance for our show, The Buzz, on the radio side, to sit down with one of his daughters, Adelita, and talk about her dad, not Congressman Grijalva, but her dad. Yeah. And she had some great stories about him, but what it came down to is the Congressman Grijalva that we all knew. Yep, that was him. You know, there wasn't much difference at home. That's who he was.
And you know, at its core, Paul, a memorial service, celebration of life. I mean, these obviously come fraught with a lot of different kinds of emotions, and yet, based on what Chris and Caitlin are saying, what you said, it feels like there was. I mean, whether it's big names like Nancy Pelosi and AOC showing up, or Republicans like David Schweikert and Juan Ciscomani, you know, we can read things into that, sure, but it does actually show something to show up for something like this. So obviously that said a lot about the kind of person and congressperson Raúl Grijalva was as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. And then one thing with the celebration of life's party, it was a party. Really, it was a party afterwards. I mean, you know, there were hundreds of people in line. They stood in line to be greeted by Adelita. And she was giving out hugs to everyone who came in. And then you know, there was somebody who was like, hey, do you want a beer? And there was a plate of Mexican food, and they came in and there were mariachis playing. It was a really great event. And I think it's sort of true to the center of who he was. You had 1,000 people who came just to see that, to go to that event, people who were dancing, people who were engaging, who were laughing, who were telling stories about him. And I mean, you kind of go like, yeah, that's how I think all of us want to be remembered, really, is not just like as this official person, this important person, but also a live human being who had relationships and also gets celebrated at the end of their life.
Yeah. Caitlin, what are your thoughts on that? Because especially even the partisanship aspect of it to me really came to light.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, but it's along that same vein. It's similar with John McCain. He treated everybody with respect. I mean, people were able to put aside party lines and their differences to pay respect to that. It's just a class act. And with Raúl, I mean, he inspired generations of leaders, especially in the Hispanic community. The young leaders that we have today, Roxana Valenzuela, the mayor of South Tucson, said that he was the first leader that looked like her and really inspired her to run. Patrick Robles, Andres Cano. I mean, these are young people that are rising the ranks that he directly impacted and inspired to run. Even his niece, Adriana Grijalva, who just was reelected for a second term of UA President, she visited my class the other day and said that he had a direct impact in her deciding to run. She was never interested in politics until she started interning for his office. So
yeah. So, Chris, one more thing as far as Adelita was concerned. Did you get a chance to ask her about how she felt about the outpouring of support for her dad?
She was, I'm not sure amazed was the right word, because obviously she's very active in the community as an elected official. She knows the community, but she was really touched by all the people showing up at the celebration of life. She said her house and her mom's houses really look like a florist shop. The last few weeks, so many people from all over the country sending flowers and notes, and she said the whole family, kind of being the spokesperson for the family, was really, really touched, and hearing so many of the stories that maybe they hadn't heard before, but they all had that theme of accessibility, or this is who Raúl was, and take him or leave him, that's who he was, but he was accessible and things like that, and they were really touched.
So, Caitlin, now that Congressman Grijalva has been laid to rest, now let's talk a little bit about politics. So, Daniel Hernandez has officially entered the race. People know him, obviously, from the horrible shooting with Gabby Giffords and many others, obviously, who passed. He was a state lawmaker. He ran for Congress and failed before. Anything standing out about his candidacy to you? Do you think there's something that is going to let him stand apart if, in fact, the Grijalva daughter does, in fact, decide to run, which we expect, but we don't know for sure? What sort of a race would that be?
I mean, I think if she decides to run, whoever is running against her has a challenge ahead of them. I mean, I think Daniel Hernandez could have a tough road ahead of him, even if she doesn't run. He has that incident with whether he actually graduated or not from the U of A, that he got called on the carpet before. I think if he can get ahead of that, maybe a little better than he did last time, or perhaps explain it a little more clearly, it won't be an issue. But it'll be interesting to see how the opposition is this time around. I mean, we have Daniel Gutierrez is back in the race again. He ran a very different campaign against Grijalva than I suspect that he will against whoever else is challenging him for this seat.
Yeah, and Paul, Daniel's sister gets a lot of attention for making noise at the state legislature.
Certainly.
And I almost wonder, it almost feels like she's from a slightly different wing of the Democratic Party. I don't know if Daniel would fit into that as well.
Do
you see more of a, is it possible we're going to see a moderate to conservative Democrat versus a more liberal Democrat, and could that be something that divides the electorate?
I mean, I think that's a really good question. That's probably how. I mean, Daniel has to sort of figure out how to make sure that he's different enough from Adelita, if she runs, that he can show the electorate that they should pick him. And then, of course, he's going to have to run against the Republicans. There are, 6 Republicans who are running? That'll be a pretty big fight, and that will also maybe slightly give us the contours of how the Democrats are going to have to talk about this, because certainly you have Gutierrez, but you also have lots of other people. I forgot his name right now, but he actually promoted himself with the sheriff of Pinal County. And so you see how the Republicans are already kind of trying to lay in the groundwork of what they want to talk about. The striking thing is, what are they going to be the main issues that they're going to want to push? I mean, one thing, of course, is a lot of these guys focused on the border. And, we see how maybe the border is maybe less of an issue now, or maybe still. So even something like that. And there's going to be big issues about what to do with, with housing, what to do with inflation, what to do with prices for groceries. All those things are really going to come into play. Yeah. So I think Daniel has to really show that he's different enough from Adelita without blowing his relationship with the party.
Well, and when it comes to the border, this is truly a border district, especially with the way it was redrawn to include Bisbee and Douglas and of course Yuma. So the border issues, I think also you can't necessarily use some of the national border talking points, because now we're looking at tariffs on the ground. What's happening with Nogales? What's happening with Douglas and places like that? So it's much more of a local issue than it is a national issue. So if whomever is running starts playing the national, on both sides, cards on that, it may not play as well in this district.
Yeah. Caitlin, last thing on this generally. So we found out now the Secretary of State, Fontes, is not going to run for the seat. That could be many reasons. It could be that he read the tea leaves and thought, well, maybe I'm not going to win. But he also put out a statement saying, I firmly believe the president is laying the groundwork to cancel elections in 2026 after this recent executive order. Regardless of the reasons that Adrian Fontes is or is not running, how does that change the race, the fact that he is not going to be in this one?
I mean, I don't think it does much. I honestly think he's been eyeing governor this whole time, and that's more of why he's not running for this. I would love it if he is hopeful to protect the election, if that's really what he wants to do, but I think he's eyeing that governor's seat more than he was CD7.
It sort of reminded me when we always talk about Doug Ducey, what's he going to do next? And the idea was he's not big enough to run for president, but he doesn't want to be a senator because then he's one of 100. And I sort of, again, not knowing what Adrian Fontes is exactly thinking, do you think I'm one of 435 potentially, or I'm someone who can really make noise against Trump and maybe make a difference for Arizona elections?
I mean, I think being Secretary of State is really, really going to be an important position. It's a position that has some power, but it's also a position that has some rhetorical power about making sure we protect elections and doing that. And there's going to be a major election in just a few years. He's going to have to run again. And I get the feeling that there's been some maybe Democrats who go, if you're in a big statewide, you want a statewide position, you need to stay there because we need to still hold these positions through the next year. Have everyone, break loose and then go run for Congress is not necessarily what the party needs.
Yeah, Chris, last
One
thing
of
on
the
this?
things I found interesting about his announcement is he made that announcement the day of the congressman's funeral. And in talking to people, one of the things I heard was, well, it's a good thing he got out of the race because he doesn't know the district, because a lot of people saw that as pretty tone deaf. You could have waited till the day after the funeral. Don't take the headlines away from the funeral. And I had heard some bubbles of things like that even before he made the announcement that, no, he doesn't know the district. Yes, he grew up here, but he lives in Maricopa County and has for a long time.
Hate those people.
So says the guy who lives in Maricopa County, right? But yeah, I think he may have read some tea leaves, not only on who else is expected to run, but also how he might have been received here.
Yeah. Prerana, other big news this week that has nothing to do with people running for office, and that was President Garimella being officially installed this week as U of A president. First of all, hasn't he been in the position for a number of months at this point?
Yes, he has. He's been in the position since October 1st. But this is also what happened with former President Robert Robbins. He was also kind of officially installed months after he already, took on the position.
So what stood out? It seems like the protests are what I was really and even what stood out as well was Mayor Romero, as she's walking past the protesters, raising a fist in solidarity, I suppose. What stood out for you as someone who covers this?
Absolutely. I think the protests themselves were really big, and I didn't expect it to be as big. I mean, obviously, all protests, make a statement and they have significance, but this was sort of really literally and symbolically very loud, because as the installation was happening, Provost Marks was, giving comments, and then there was a native land acknowledgement. During all of that, there were students who were standing right by the barricades, outside of Old Main, and they were shouting slogans of, trying to keep the cultural and resource centers open. And the larger fight that they have is about, keeping DEI, because obviously, this has been reported that post, Trump's DEI orders, the president and the administration, they've kind of taken down the Office of Diversity and Inclusion website, and they've removed the words committed to diversity and inclusion from the native land acknowledgement statement. So this is kind of just a larger fight towards that. And obviously, Mayor Romero kind of pumping her fist into the air was very symbolic again, but again, none of the reporters actually got to ask her what she meant by that, but one can, make assumptions that it could be in solidarity of, the protesters.
Did the president or any spokespeople for the university comment on the protest?
No, they did not. They did comment on the protest, which happened yesterday, which was the same kind of fight to keep the cultural and resource centers open. There were about 100 faculty, students, staff, related to the cultural centers. They walked all the way to Old Main and they hand delivered the DEI petition outside of Old Main, and they actually wanted to deliver it to the president, but the door was locked, so they left it outside. And as of when they were delivering the petition, it had about 3,300 signatures. So this is just kind of a message that the community is sending to the administration that they really want to keep DEI. And in response to that, UA spokesperson Mitch Zak said that he appreciates, he and the administration and the president, they kind of appreciate and acknowledge what's coming from the community, but they have to take into account all the federal, the federal research funding, the Pell Grant funding, everything that comes from the administration.
Chris, anything stand out for you about this?
A lot of what she said, certainly Mayor Romero, I don't think Mayor Romero does many things like that by mistake. She certainly knew what she was doing, and she was standing, the pictures I saw, I was out there early and then Hannah Cree was covering it for us. The pictures that I saw, she was very close to the president physically when she did that. So I'm sure he saw it. This is one of those times I'm glad I'm not president of a university, because as we said, there's a lot to balance. There's federal funding, and there's plenty of federal funding moving around this campus. But then there are a lot of people. 3,000 people took the time to sign a petition. That's a lot of people that these decisions affect, and he's got to figure out how to balance it. I'm glad it's not my job.
I mean, I think really what stood out for me was the sit-out by the student body president and many members of the executive team. They made a decision the night before that they were not going to participate. She was supposed to give a speech right before the governor and put out a statement on Instagram the night before saying she was going to stand in solidarity with students who were feeling unheard and overlooked. She was visiting my class that morning before she went and protested with students and talked a lot about the relationship that she has had with President Garimella versus President Robbins and his level of accessibility. And it does not sound like he's been accessible to student leadership at all. She said that with President Robbins, for all his faults, she had his cell phone number and could call or text him when she needed something and he would respond. She has to go up the chain and does not get much FaceTime with him, does not get phone calls with him. And she actually said that he spends more time communicating with the Bobcats, which is the student group that liaises with donors and the foundation, than he does with the elected student officials. So I think that's quite telling.
Are you hearing that as well, Prerana?
Yeah, absolutely. I think even yesterday when we were at the march to deliver the DEI petition, the protesters were just talking about how they haven't heard from the president at all about what he thinks of DEI, where he stands on DEI. It's just, coming to them with mixed messages of, oh, we are still dedicated to DEI, but at the same time taking out the words from the land acknowledgement statement. So what they really want, and I think what they're really frustrated and hungry for, is a response. They, obviously they want a response that says, oh, we keep the cultural centers, but at this point they just want the administration to acknowledge and respond to them.
Okay. I'm not even sure how many of our viewers or listeners know what the provost would do, but there are some provost finalists that have come to visit the university. Can you give us an idea of where these folks have come from and what the university may be looking for?
Absolutely. So the provost search. So first of all, the provost position is someone who kind of looks at all the faculty and academic functioning and faculty development and student affairs. And obviously the position is now being held in the interim by Ron Marks. And when President Garimella, he came to the U of A, December 10th is when he put out an announcement saying that they're moving ahead with the provost search. And after months of kind of filtering and interview process, there have been 4 candidates who have reach the final round, and 3 have already been to campus for in-person interviews and a recruitment visit. And so 2 of those 3 candidates are from Purdue University, which is again something notable because President Garimella was at Purdue University before he was president of the University of Vermont. And even in prior searches, when they were hiring the senior vice president for research, faculty and students and staff were kind of talking about how these really high-level positions are coming from universities that the president has been at before. So 2 of them are from Purdue University, and 1 is from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And I think I've sat at all of the open forums. Each candidate has an open forum where all faculty, students, staff can come and ask them questions. And in those forums, one thing that has always stood out for me is the DEI question. Every candidate is being asked about how they're going to deal with DEI. And all the candidates, I think, unanimously are just trying to do the balancing game. They're talking about how we're going to have to watch what we say publicly, but at the same time acknowledging that the UFA is a Hispanic serving institution and DEI is a part of its core and a part of its essence, and it's not something that just goes away, and the legislation cannot make it go away. So that's something that stood out for me from the provost search.
So the last thing on that, is there a feeling, you mentioned the Purdue connection with President Garimella, is there a feeling that the provost is often in lockstep with the president and the president is going to be able to be the one to make the call, so we're almost like a governor, lieutenant governor kind of thing?
Absolutely. So what happens after the open forums is all of the faculty, anyone who attends the open forums, they fill out a feedback form, and all of that directly goes to the president. So the president is the one who kind of makes the final decision. And obviously, the president and the provost have to kind of be in tandem. They have to, keep communicating, and they have to keep talking about faculty and students and the academic mission. And I think the sense of what I've gotten so far is that Provost Marks has been the person that, all these cultural center folks are talking to about DEI. So he's kind of the point person to get to the administration and the president.
Okay. Paul, let's move on to a totally different story. You did really interesting reporting on Raytheon protests, which happened in late 2023. A group called the Tucson Coalition for Palestine protests at the UA Science and Technology Park, specifically related to a building that is leased to Raytheon. Just give us a little bit of, I think people can guess with its Raytheon and a group called Tucson Coalition for Palestine what they were protesting, but what was the protest about specifically, and how many people got involved?
So the protest had a couple of hundred people, and they were there really specifically to protest against Raytheon's production of military weapons, bombs, missiles, etc., and all that going and being used in Gaza. Again, and part of Israel's war with Hamas, which has also killed a lot of civilians. And so there's been kind of a continuous series of protests against Raytheon. There was protests here at the U of A campus as well about the war in Gaza. So this group of people, 100 people, a few dozen went and actually protested sort of on the property. Pima County Sheriff's deputies asked them to leave. A group of them decided that they didn't want to leave immediately, and they ended up being under arrest. There's 4 of them specifically who have sued, and they've sued on the idea that their actions are protected by the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is a federal act, and then there's a state one that's basically the same thing. And the idea is that the police, it doesn't mean you can do things illegal because you have a religious belief that you can, but what it says is that...
So it's not like legislative immunity.
It's not a legislative immunity. It's a good one. But really it's that the police and other authorities have to act in the least restrictive means. And so in this particular case, the argument is it's not that they push them off the property, and not necessarily that they arrested them. It's the fact that the county is continuing to prosecute them. They're all being charged with misdemeanor trespassing. And so their attorney, his name is Greg Kuykendall, who spent a lot of time actually using RFRA to defend other people, and he's been pretty successful at it. One major case that really happened was with the folks who were activists with No More Deaths. They were prosecuted for leaving water and food in Cabeza Prieta, which is nationally protected land. And there the feds cited them with trespassing, and Kuykendall said, look, that violates RFRA. They have a religious belief to be there because they're trying to save people from dying. And they won their case. And then there was another case by Amy Knight, who worked for Greg, and she made similar arguments and actually helped defend an activist who was with the tribe about the construction of border wall and Oregon pipe. And so really the central argument is, can the government restrict your religious freedom, and how is it the least restrictive means? And so there's a balance test in that. And so right now the judge has to decide whether he accepts jurisdiction for this case, whether it's his or he sends it back down to Green Valley. And then the other one is whether or not he agrees that RFRA does protect people. So theoretically, he may agree and they may have their charges waived. He may disagree, in which case they actually have to go through the prosecution. So we'll have to see. And he said he would take it under advisement. We expect a decision maybe in a week or two.
And briefly, these four are all of different religious affiliations.
Correct. One woman is Jewish rabbi. One gentleman is a pastor, and then the other two just have said this is my own personal belief. And so yeah, I mean, there's definitely one thing with the case. One of the cases, No More Deaths, is that the test isn't like, do you have to show what you're religious? You don't have to prove that you're a Baptist. You don't have to prove that you're Catholic. You have to prove that you believe this enough. One of the gentlemen who was done it essentially argued that he was an animist, that he believed the desert was important by itself, and he won because that was enough. So, you know, and we'll see whether or not the judge agrees with this, but I mean, the structure's there for it, and you know, again, Kuykendall has actually done fairly well in these cases.
Yeah. Chris, any brief thoughts on this?
It's interesting just looking at RFRA and the history of it. It comes out of a U.S. Supreme Court case that the justices wrote, the First Amendment protects religion, but, you know, general laws, and it's fine. And that's what RFRA came from. And it's changed over time. It's always been a little bit controversial, but it's changed over time, especially since gay marriage was allowed. That's when we really saw RFRA coming up, but the way it's been used has changed over time. But yeah, it's been used very successfully here a number of times in those cases.
Yeah, and so we'll be watching closely on that one. Paul, you're going to cover it in the Sentinel once the decision is out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, waiting to see when the judge comes up with the decision, and then we'll kind of figure out what the consequences of that decision are. Again, with the case may be completely waived and we're done, or the case could get kicked down to Green Valley, in which case we'll have to see what happens, and we're certainly going to go into appeal court.
Terrific. Okay, Paul, Caitlin, Prerana, Chris, thank you all for being here on this edition of the Press Room. Thank you all very much for watching as well. We'll be back with another edition coming up next week. I'm Steve Goldstein. Have a good night.